bringing the people behind our food to life.
And now we're going to hear from Kathy Hessler, who I mentioned earlier is a head of the Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm a lawyer, as Kendra said, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the law relates to these conversations. And I'm going to do a sort of basic overview before I get into the organ-specific stuff, because what I usually end up saying tends to surprise people. So one of the things that we do in the clinic is we look for ways to deal with the externalized costs that aren't addressed elsewhere. We also have a mission in the clinic to look at the interests of animals and to make sure that they're considered, and that's not being done generally anywhere else. And so, but we're also looking at the effects of the externalized costs of these CAFOs on human health, on environment, on workers' rights, on communities, autonomy, on zoning, all kinds of issues that I'll talk about briefly in a minute. So one of the things that we end up having to discuss is, where is our starting point in the law? Our starting point in the law is that animals are property. And they're no different than this microphone or this table under the law in most respects. And the interests of the owners are what is the focal point of the law, not the interests of the animals. And in some ways this may be a surprise to you, in some ways it may not. But what does that actually mean? Well, at the federal level, I think most people tend to think that there are too many federal laws, right? And that we could do with a few less. In the federal system, there are absolutely no laws, none, not a one, that regulates the welfare of animals while they're being raised on farms. Okay? None. So there aren't inspectors going and deciding whether any farmer, factory farmer or otherwise, is breaking a law in how they choose to raise the animals. Now, this made some sense historically when, as Kendra said, it was in the farmer's interest to take care of the animals on the farm. Now that we have moved to a corporate model and efficiency is the watchword and profits are the watchword, the interests of the animals are secondary at best. Okay, so what federal laws do we have? Well, we have the Animal Welfare Act that people may be familiar with, and it entirely exempts agricultural animals. So not particularly helpful there, right? Okay. What else do we have? We have something called the 28-hour transport law. And this rule says if you're going to transport animals, agricultural and otherwise, more than 28 hours, you actually have to stop and give them food and water, and you have to be attentive to the climatic conditions. So if there's heat, you have to be aware of that, and you have to be aware of cold and things like that. So interesting thing about this law, it entirely exempts poultry, which of course is the largest number of animals used in agribusiness, and it doesn't require any certain level of care below 28 hours of transportation. Okay, you can do whatever you think is best. And this is particularly important because with the vertical integration of agribusiness, right, there are fewer slaughterhouses in local communities, and the animals are being transported greater and greater distances. So another difficulty. So that law federally doesn't really help us. What else we have? We have this Humane Slaughter Act. So the Humane Slaughter Act talks about how animals are slaughtered, not how they're raised. It, again, totally exempts poultry, and it has ritual slaughter exemptions, and I can tell you that it's not particularly well enforced. So that's it on the federal level. The only other slight thing that we have on the federal level is the organic standard, and so to the degree that an entity puts itself up for this voluntary certification, they do have to meet additional guidelines that actually do affect the welfare of animals, that the animals have to be out in their natural sort of habitat a certain number of days throughout the year, and they have to have access to more natural foods and things like that. But that's it at the federal level. So I promise it won't be all gloom and doom. So what do we have at the state level? Well, we have a lot more innovation at the state level. And one thing I should also say is, has already been said that the EPA has a designation for CAFO, so you might actually think they have some rules, but they don't have any rules on this either, just so you know. Okay, so in the states, we have a number of laws in the states that people are using to their advantage to try and get some movement in this area. So we have anti-cruelty laws. So you all know that you're not supposed to, kick your dogs, right, or starve them or beat them or do bad things to them. Those laws, again, exempt agribusiness animals, generally speaking. Not always. Here in Oregon, we have good news in that there's an exception for farmed animals, but there's an exemption to that exception if people, I know this is the law, right? Bear with me. So if the people are behaving in a way that isn't consistent with traditional farm sort of behavior or standards, then you can maybe get at the behavior. So it's something that we're looking into. There's not a whole lot of hope that we're going to get very far in Oregon on this for the traditional CAFO kinds of activities. And what we're talking about is not, the things that you hear in the news about someone who's using, a forklift to attack animals or doing some really horrific things that you hear, as I say, in the news. We're talking about the systemic kinds of things that can be deemed abuse, like debeaking without anesthesia and tail docking and all kinds of other activities that are deemed to be necessary because of the concentrated confinement that animals find themselves in. So people are working on that here in Oregon and in other states, and we'll keep you posted. What else? We have ballot initiatives, as most of you have heard, right, in different states. Prop 2 most recently, a couple years ago in California, but we have ballot initiatives around the country trying to address some of the most cruel procedures that are going on in the factory farms. So, and we're having some success addressing that. The thing that's really interesting to me to note about that is we don't have any single legislative initiatives, right? So these are all coming from the people. People are saying, we don't like these practices and we want to stop them. The legislators are not going forward and saying, we need to endorse a different kind of ethic in our farms or in these factories, with one exception, and that's New Jersey. So New Jersey came up with a standard, and they said, look, we need to develop standards. They came up with a rule that said they need to develop standards. The Department of Agriculture in New Jersey said, well, pretty much what the farmers say is good with us. And the court said, no, that's not developing a standard. They sent it back, and that's still in process. The other thing that's happening statewide is, nationwide in some states, is the development of agricultural or livestock boards. And the idea of these boards is that they're supposed to be made up of experts, and they're supposed to develop some kind of standards for the states. Most of these boards have come online in response to or as a preventative measure against the ballot initiatives, right? So they don't want people saying what the factory farms can and can't do, so they're going to put a board in place and decide how that's going to go. So those are evolving around the nation. The Ohio case is sort of really interesting because that was done at a constitutional level. So the board was set up as a constitutional amendment, and then they thought that was a way to cut off folks from having a ballot initiative. The folks in Ohio were not done, and so they put forward a ballot initiative to say what the board should find were appropriate standards. And then the governor brokered a deal between animal, environmental, and farm interests. So we'll see how that ends up working out. So, as you know, one state's already banned tail docking, 2 states battery cages, 5 states veal crates, 7 states gestation crates. And so we're talking about, again, some really egregious behavior. In Oregon, we have some opportunities and we have some specific challenges. There's something called the right to farm law that every state has some version of. The implications of it here in Oregon is that if you wanted, as a farmer next to a CAFO, or as a family member, just a community member next to a CAFO, if you wanted to file a lawsuit saying that this entity is a nuisance in your community, you can't do it. So there's a law in Oregon saying you can't do it. And if you try to do it, you're going to lose and you're going to pay the attorney's fees of the other side. So it's an interesting situation because in other states have actually made some good progress with their nuisance laws. All right. So what are we doing about all this? What are we working on and where are we getting some success? So obviously the environmental approaches here in Oregon and around the country are getting some of the most traction, because the environmental degradation that results from the factory farms is so clear to so many people. Now understand that the environmental laws, again, people think the EPA has too many regulations and the federal government's meddling too much. Most of these federal laws